And you have a major crisis that breaks out in 2014. This is when the Russians take Crimea, as you well know, and the civil war on the Donbass breaks out. This is 2014. I want to emphasize that between 2008 and 2014, even though we doubled down and we were expanding NATO so as to bring in Ukraine, we were not doing that with the thought in mind that we had to contain Russia. That was not part of the program. There may have been a few people in the bowels of the establishment who were thinking in those terms, but that's not the way policymakers were talking, as best we can tell from the available evidence. After 2014, after February 22nd, 2014, when the major crisis breaks out in Ukraine, we do a 180-degree turn, and all of a sudden, we're painting the Russians, and Putin in particular, as a really serious threat to Europe that has to be contained. So it's just important to understand that it's in 2014 that containment of Russia gets linked to NATO expansion. That is not the case before 2014. I want to make one further point on this, and that is a lot of the planning documents from the 1990s are now publicly available. And it's very clear from those documents that the Americans understood, the policymaking establishment understood that bringing Ukraine into NATO was a very special case. And you were really asking for trouble if you brought Ukraine into NATO. American policymakers understood that Ukraine was probably a bridge too far. And of course, in April 2008, at the NATO Bucharest summit, when we say that we're going to bring Ukraine into NATO, it's perfectly clear that all our fears were justified. But again, just to repeat myself, because it's very important, instead of backing off and trying to accommodate the Russians, we believe that we can shove NATO expansion into Ukraine down their throat. And we find out on February 24th, 2022, that we were wrong. We can't shove it down their throat. They will not accept it. And here we are today in the middle of a war that has gone on now for over 3 years because of our unwillingness or our inability to accept the fact that this would be NATO expansion, that is, an existential threat to Russia.
You just heard Professor John Mearsheimer, University of Chicago political scientist and one of America's sharpest critics of liberal interventionism, deliver a devastating truth. The West didn't start containing Russia until 2014, but the war was set in motion long before that. And he didn't stop there. He revealed something most Western media refuses to admit. Bringing Ukraine into NATO was always seen as a bridge too far, and U.S. policymakers knew it would provoke Russia. Yet they did it anyway. And now, we're in a war that has lasted over 3 years, not because of Russian aggression alone, but because of Western arrogance, historical amnesia, and a refusal to accept Russia's red lines. Let's unpack what Mearsheimer said, and why this moment reveals the true origins of the Ukraine war. Mearsheimer begins with a crucial fact. Before 2014, NATO expansion was not about containing Russia. That's right. Despite what the mainstream media tells you today, NATO's original post-Cold War mission was not to contain Moscow. It was sold as a peacekeeping alliance, a stability framework, a club of democracies. And even as NATO expanded eastward, bringing in Poland, Hungary, the Baltics, the idea of containing Russia wasn't part of the official narrative. But then came 2014. And everything changed. On February 22, 2014, the Ukrainian government was overthrown in what many call a Western-backed coup. Russia responded by taking Crimea, citing historical ties and security concerns. And the Donbass conflict erupted. That's when the West did a complete 180-degree turn. Suddenly, Putin was labeled an expansionist threat. Suddenly, Russia had to be contained. And suddenly, NATO expansion became a moral crusade, not a strategic gamble. But here's the truth. Containment was retroactively applied, not planned from the start. And that's a key point Mearsheimer emphasizes. Because it shows that the West changed the story after the crisis began, not before. Mearsheimer makes a bold claim. backed by declassified documents. American policymakers in the 1990s knew that bringing Ukraine into NATO would be a bridge too far. And they were right. Ukraine is not just any country. It shares deep historical, cultural, and strategic ties with Russia. It borders Russia. It contains key Russian naval bases. And most importantly, it's central to Russia's security doctrine. So when the US and NATO said at the 2008 Bucharest summit, Ukraine will become a member of NATO, they weren't just making a policy statement. They were drawing a red line across Russia's throat. And they knew it. Declassified planning documents from the 1990s show that US officials understood this would provoke Moscow. Yet they pushed forward. Why? Because they believed they could shove NATO expansion down Russia's throat and get away with it. Mearsheimer delivers one of his most damning lines. Instead of backing off and trying to accommodate the Russians, we believed we could shove NATO expansion into Ukraine down their throat. That's not diplomacy. That's imperial arrogance. And it's based on a false assumption. Russia won't fight. It's weak. It's declining. It will accept our dominance. But Russia didn't accept it. And on February 24, 2022, the world learned the truth. Russia will not tolerate NATO on its border. Not in Ukraine. Not now. Not ever. And the West's refusal to accept that reality, to recognize that NATO expansion into Ukraine is an existential threat to Russia, is the root cause of this war. Not Putin's aggression. Not Russian imperialism. But Western strategic overreach. Mearsheimer doesn't just explain history, he exposes how the truth is buried. Because if the public understood that, the US knew this would provoke Russia. NATO expansion was always controversial. The 2014 coup was backed by the West. Putin wasn't seen as a threat until after Crimea. Then the entire moral justification for the war collapses. So the West rewrites history. It says, Russia invaded unprovoked. But Mearsheimer reminds us. The crisis began with a regime change in Kiev, supported by the US and EU. Then came NATO's promise to bring Ukraine in. Then came Russia's response. And now, we're in a war that has killed hundreds of thousands, displaced millions, and brought the world closer to nuclear conflict than at any time since the Cold War. All because the West refused to accommodate Russia's legitimate security concerns. Mearsheimer ends with a sobering truth. We are in this war today because of our unwillingness, or inability, to accept that NATO expansion into Ukraine is an existential threat to Russia. And until that reality is acknowledged, there can be no peace. Because no nation, not the US, not China, not Israel, would tolerate a hostile military alliance on its border. So why expect Russia to? The tragedy is that this war was predictable. It was warned about, by Mearsheimer, by George Kennan, by diplomats, by intelligence analysts. But the deep state, the neocons, and the military-industrial complex ignored them. Because they believed in unipolarity. In American dominance. In regime change. And now, the bill has come due. In conclusion, John Mearsheimer gives us a rare and unfiltered look at the real origins of the Ukraine war. Not a sudden act of Russian aggression. But the inevitable result of Western overreach, of pushing NATO to Russia's doorstep, ignoring warnings, and refusing diplomacy. This war didn't start in 2022. It started in 2008. And its roots go back even further. Until the West admits this truth, the killing will continue. Stay tuned for more analysis right here on The Informed Perspective. Until next time, stay informed, and think critically.
We clearly are in a multipolar world today, where the United States, China, Russia, and arguably other countries, India, another, and I would say Europe, if it could ever get its act together, but it does not currently have its act together, would be another, now compete for power, but without norms, without a shared vision, and indeed, I would say in a world in which the West, meaning the US-led world, is rather desperately trying to keep its primacy or its hold on power over China, Russia, and the BRICS countries more generally. So that's a lot of disruption. Add in the fact that we have climate disasters everywhere, an inconvenient point that is brushed aside by many, for example, by Trump and others, because it just doesn't fit other narratives, but is extraordinarily real.